and welcome to the podcast of the damned, where the horror commentary is so hot, it comes straight from hell. I am your host, Ian, and this is a brand new series here on the podcast of the damned that will be exclusive to both our Patreon subscribers and our YouTube channel. This will be getting released on the Patreon every single Wednesday moving forward, and then later it'll go on to the YouTube channel every single Saturday. So sign up to our Patreon for just £1 and you will get immediate 4-day early access to all of our remake reviews series. In today's episode, we're talking about the 2007 remake of Halloween. This was directed and written by Rob Zombie, stars Scout Taylor-Compton, Malcolm McDowell and Tyler Mane, with a huge supporting cast of Brad Dourif, Sherry Moon Zombie, William Forsythe, Danny Trejo, Bill Moseley, Danielle Harris, Sid Haig, Dee Wallace and Ken Faree. The Imdb plot is as follows. After being committed for 17 years, Michael Myers, now a grown man and still very dangerous, escapes from the mental institution and immediately returns to Haddonfield to find his baby sister Laurie. The taglines for this episode, this movie: evil has a destiny, the face behind the mask, evil unmasked, when darkness fell, he arrived. A whole host of different taglines there for the movie, and this is where we start. So the whole point of this series is to highlight remakes, highlight horror remakes. Horror remakes are traditionally get a very, very bad rap from the horror community. You know, there's a whole host of people out there who just don't want to admit that horror remakes even have a place and that it is a legitimate subgenre of horror, and I completely disagree with that. I think that remakes are absolutely a legitimate subgenre of horror. I am very, very much the give remakes a chance guy on the socials media, and that's not to say though that there are remakes out there that I just don't think are very good. There's remakes out there that I don't think that should have been made. There absolutely is, and we will talk about them in the coming days, weeks, months, years, however long this extra series decides to go on for. These episodes are going to be relatively short. I want to keep these episodes short, probably 2 or 3 around 10-minute mark, where I'm just going to go over some brief aspects of the film. I'll talk a little bit about it. I'll do maybe a little bit of trivia. If I have time, we'll do some of the critics' ratings. I'll give a little rating for myself at the end as well. So these are going to be relatively short videos. That's the whole point of them. I want to keep them short, neat and tidy. So let's talk about Halloween 2007, written and directed by Rob Zombie. Now, as anyone who has listened to any episode of the podcast of the damned will know, I am possibly the biggest Halloween fan out there. You know, I've listed it umpteen times as my favorite horror movie of all time, my favorite movie of all time. I'm a massive Halloween fan, and all the sequels. And I understand that, you know, it's a franchise of declining return over the years. Some of the sequels are essentially god-awful, but I still love them. That's how big a fan of the franchise I am. Even the really, really bad ones, I still like them. I still want to watch them, even though I know they're bad. So, you know, that's the sort of place where I'm coming from with this. And I think that sometimes means when I do give genuine criticism to the franchise, for me personally, that might give it a little bit more weight, just because, you know, I'm someone who is very, very forgiving of the franchise anyway. So who knows? But, you know, the whole point of this is just to give you my opinion. You guys, obviously, if you haven't seen the movie, we're gonna talk about heavy spoilers. If you haven't seen it, please go away and watch the film, or not, it's up to you, but I highly encourage everyone form their own opinion about movies. At no point are we trying to say that my opinion here is gospel. I am simply just giving you my opinion. I highly encourage everyone to go and form your own opinions, and if you disagree with me, that's great. And if you want to tell me you disagree with me, that's also great. You can do so in the comments. You can email me at podofthedamned@gmail.com. Please do let me know your thoughts. You know, I want to open up discourse. I want to open up discussion, and, you know, you letting me know how you feel. You can also get us on Twitter at Damned Podcast. We're on Facebook. We're on Instagram, Podcast of the Damned. You can get us on pretty much all the social media platforms. So if you have something to say, or if you want us to read out some of your thoughts on future episodes, then please go ahead and do that. But we're here to talk about Halloween 2007. This is possible. I wanted to start with a movie that I didn't out and out hate, but I don't out and out love as well. And there's a few reasons for that. because I'm going to start obviously with the positives of this movie. And there are, for me, quite a lot of positives to this film. I think one of the things, especially in recent years, that we've been looking for from a Halloween movie, especially when you sort of come out of the H2O, the H20, sorry, and the resurrection period, is you're really looking for getting back to that sort of brutality that Michael Myers showed in the very first Halloween movie. And of course, since then, we've had Halloween 2018, we've had Halloween Kills, in which, probably is the most brutal Michael Myers, I would say, specifically Halloween Kills. And Halloween Kills is relatively low down on my list of Halloween movies in terms of their ranks, but, it's still possibly one of the most brutal ones out there. And I think this one, obviously, with it being Rob Zombie, has really tried to play on that. You watch Rob Zombie movies and they're hyper violent. You're talking about House of a Thousand Corpses, Lords of Salem. You're talking about 31. You're talking about Devil's Rejects, and a whole host of other movies as well. They're all always hyper violent. A hyper coarse as well, and this movie is no different in that aspect. And I'm not sure I'm a huge fan of the everything being super sexualized in this movie. For me, it doesn't really sit well. It's very much sits well with the sort of theme of Rob Zombie and how he wants to direct his movies, but it something about it in conjunction with the Halloween storyline just didn't quite sit right with me. Another thing that sort of about this movie, obviously, it's quite a long movie. It's, I think, still to this day the longest movie in the franchise, and we spend essentially the first hour getting the backstory to Michael Myers and finding out, why and how he became what he became. We see him as a young child. We hear him talk, which is obviously something that again doesn't happen in any of the other Halloween movies. And I'm not 100% sure that there was a huge group of people that were really clamoring to get that Michael Myers backstory. Because for me, one of the big things, one of the scary aspects of him as a character in that original movie specifically, is that he is just mindless killer who could come through your door in the middle of the night at any time and kill you indiscriminately for absolute no apparent reason whatsoever. And that's for me what makes Michael Myers terrifying. So giving him this backstory, giving him this reasons for wanting to do the things that he does, and then also obviously in Halloween 2 from the 1980s, it's the one that introduced the brother sister storyline, which has very much divides opinion in my as far as I'm aware. I'm personally of the opinion that I prefer not knowing that as being part of the story to that being part of the story. And obviously, again, when we're talking about the most recent ones, the 2018, 2022, 2021, sorry, Halloween movies, they go back in that and they explicitly say that. Whereas here in this movie, they keep that up. They keep that up, and I'm not sure, again, as someone who's not a particularly big fan of that sort of plot point, I wasn't particularly happy to see it here again. Like I said, there's some really good things about this. It's got all those people that you would normally expect to see in a Rob Zombie movie. Sherry Moon is in there, William Forsythe, Danny Trejo, Bill Moseley's in it briefly, Sid Haig. They're all there. But it is good to see, it's good to see some real horror royalty in there as well. When you're talking about horror icons, it really doesn't get that much bigger than Brad Dourif, the voice of Chucky himself in this movie, and not in it for an insignificant period of time as well. And having said that, Halloween royalty as well in Danielle Harris being in this movie. And I think that was a really nice touch, having Danielle Harris in this movie. I think that gave it a little bit of a bridge to the sort of the original franchise. Obviously she appears in 4 and 5. So it was nice to see her in here. Obviously, as a different role, she's playing Annie in this movie. So, obviously playing a very different role to Jamie Lloyd. But I was definitely happy to see Danielle Harris in this movie. And I challenge anyone to say that, they weren't happy to see her in this film. Malcolm McDowell as Sam Loomis, I actually think did a pretty decent job as Sam Loomis. For me, he's never going to be anything close to what Donald Pleasance brought to the role. However, Malcolm McDowell has one of those voices that is very, very good at just delivering really, sort of big, dramatic pieces of verbiage. I go back and I think to um, he played the voice of President Eden in Fallout 3, and just constantly having his voice in the background is very, very distinctive, and I think is a voice that does fit the role of Sam Loomis particularly well. So I think that was a pretty good casting. There's a few parts where it feels very much like he's trying to say things to be dramatic and have a bit of gravitas, and for me they don't quite land. It just doesn't really work. But aside from that, I think he does a really good job. My problem is, ultimately, and whilst I like Danielle Harris, and I automatically like her, and the same goes for Brad Dourif, and everyone else that's in this film as well, I'm not necessarily sure I like any of the characters in this movie, and that's always a big issue for me. I don't really feel like I've got anything to root for. You've got Scout Taylor Compton in here as Laurie Strode. Number one, she doesn't appear until 52 minutes into the movie, which is basically halfway through the film. And her initial interactions with her parents and things like that are just a little bit iffy and weird and off. So for me, like there's no one really to root for in this movie. And I'm sorry if she's listening, but whilst I still think she does a good job in the film, and I'm sure Rob Zombie was very happy with the direction that she took the role of Laurie Strode in, for me, doesn't really hold a candle to Jamie Lee Curtis. Jamie Lee Curtis is always going to be the Laurie Strode. So definitely a little bit of an issue with that there. A couple of other things before we move on. I have the score, obviously all the big sort of hits, and they were doing the callbacks to the originals, and some of the kills were very similar, and we sort of repeated some of the scenes. We have that original Halloween score in there, but it just didn't, it felt like that could have been amped up a lot more. The actual classic John Carpenter score felt a little bit muted to me at times, and didn't really get used to its full effect. So I really felt like that could have been utilized a lot better than it ultimately was. But that again could just be a personal preference thing rather than a technical thing. Like I say, I'm not massively knowledgeable about these sorts of things, so definitely something that for me I would have liked to have seen like super amped up. I think they do that in the new one, in Halloween 2018 and Halloween Ends. They really dig in deep and get grimy with the theme tune, and I wish they'd done a little bit more of that in there, because it's kind of jarring. You have that, but then you have what I would consider is a classic Rob Zombie score, where you've got songs like Don't Fear the Reaper, and whilst I love that kind of music as well, it didn't really mash up particularly well for me with the Halloween movie. The final big thing, and trigger warning now for anyone, just in case this is, and I'm really going to be very brief about it. I do not understand why we need the rape scene in here. It was initially cut. I watched the unrated version for this review. You can go and watch it without the rape scene, which I would probably recommend that you go and do, because it's highly unnecessary to anything to do with the movie. They use it to try and facilitate Michael Myers' escape, and they could have done that in so many different ways. So for me, a completely unnecessary scene that didn't need to be in here, and only really serves to disgust people and horrify people and trigger people, and I just didn't feel it was at all necessary to be in this movie. But like I said, there's lots of positives about this. I like the brutality, I like the acting and the cast. Costuming and special effects are all for me fine in this movie. There's good things about it. However, I'm not sure Halloween is something that would really work for this kind of Rob Zombie style. And don't get me wrong, I love some of Rob Zombie's work. I do love House of a Thousand Corpses. I love Devil's Rejects and some of his other stuff as well. But for me, just it didn't really mesh. It's like they were trying to make two different movies, which is kind of what they did, because Rob Zombie had went to the studio saying that he had two ideas, and one of them was essentially the first hour of the movie, where we get young Michael Myers and we figure out, what caused his sort of mental breakdowns and what caused him to lash out and all those sorts of things. And then his other idea was to do the second half, essentially, which was more, not necessarily beat for beat, but more of a close remake to the original. And we ended up getting this sort of mishmash of the two, and it didn't really work for me. The pacing for the film felt really off, essentially because we get, 55 minutes of this sort of prequel, if you will, this sort of pre-story and backstory to Michael Myers, which is fine, but then you also get like an extra hour just of Halloween, slightly condensed, and it just doesn't mesh well for me. So ultimately, I'm not going to give this movie a particularly high score, but I'm not going to give it a low score. This is still a movie that if it's on, I will watch it, and I will encourage other people to watch it too. It made money as well at the box office. You know, it had a budget of, according to IMDb, of $15 million and grossed 80 million. So it made money, which is obviously why the second movie got greenlit. But I think the less we say about the second movie at this stage, probably for the better. We may go on and do that at another time. Quickly go through the ratings. IMDb scored it a 6.0. Metacritic giving it 4.7. The Rotten Tomatoes critics scoring it just 28% rotten. The Rotten Tomatoes audience giving it 59%. Critics consensus: Rob Zombie doesn't bring many new ideas to the table in Halloween, making it another bloody disappointment for fans of the franchise. And I don't necessarily wholeheartedly agree with that, because he did bring a new idea. He brought a whole hour worth of new ideas to the table. But once you got to essentially what was the reboot of Halloween, then yeah, I can definitely see that argument being thrown in there. But you know, I think that's a little bit harsh. I personally don't hate this movie. I don't love this movie, and I'm gonna throw it slap bang in the middle, and I'm gonna give it 5 out of 10. So with that being said, that's gonna do it for this week's remake reviews. Like I say, this is something that I'm hoping is going to be a new weekly segment here on Patreon and on the YouTube channel. You can follow us across all the social medias on Twitter at Damned Podcast. We're on Facebook. We're on Instagram, Podcast of the Damned. Email me your thoughts, podofthedamned@gmail.com. You can support us on Patreon. Have your name scrolling along the bottom of this screen just like everyone else. Go to patreon.com/podofthedamned. You can sign up for just £1. You get early access to these episodes. They're usually about 3 or 4 days, depending on how much editing time I have. And that goes up on the Patreon. It'll go up on the Patreon on Wednesdays. It'll go up on the YouTube over the weekends. And yeah, you get your name added to that list. Support the show. Help me make improvements to the show. Help the main show as well. Check out the main show. Check out the Podcast of the Damned. We release episodes every single Tuesday on various different horror topics. We've just released an episode earlier this week on Deep Blue Sea. Next week on the show, we're going to have Candy, the final girl, returning to the show, and we're going to be talking about Cube. So please do tune in for those as well. We've also got other mini reviews that we're going to be doing on the Patreon as well. At the end of last month, at the end of March, we released one on Pieces, and I do plan on doing the odd one here or there for them as well on the Patreon as well. And in future, they will also be added to the YouTube channel at some point down the line. But thank you once again for you guys for tuning in. Please subscribe to this YouTube channel as well. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And until next week, just remember, you're damned if you do, and you're damned if you don't.